Hello, good evening, everybody. I am pleased to open the 18th Luca Dagliano lecture in development economics. I am Giorgio Barba Navaretti. I am the scientific director of the Centro Studi Luca Dagliano and also the president of Collegio Carlo Alberto. And this is it is the second year that third year that this lecture is taking place at Collegio Carlo Alberto. And as you know, some of you maybe know, the Centro Studi Luca Dagliano is headquartered in Collegio Carlo Alberto and works with Collegio Carlo Alberto in a very strict academic and scientific relationships. And all the activities of the Centro Studi in Torino are carried out here, whereas the other activities are carried out in Milano. This is the 18th lectures. This is an old tradition that we have been having for a long time. And I'm very pleased to welcome Oriana Bandiera. Oriana is the Sir Anthony Atkinson Chair in Economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science at LSE. It is a great pleasure to have her with us. Oriana is also slightly at home because she's also the vice president of Collegio Carlo Alberto, so she knows where she is. She knows the institutions that is hosting her lecture. And so I only have to thank a few people that essentially have been working a lot for this lecture, for organizing this lecture. So I want to thank all the staff at Centro Studi Luca Dagliano, and especially Chiara Elli, and at Collegio Carlo Alberto, and especially Cinzia Agliani and Alberto Galvan, that have been working on organizing these lectures. Naturally, usually we have this lecture in presence, as you know, but we are forced to have it on the webinar, and we are a bit sad to have it on the webinar, but at least we can have a large audience attending. I'm very pleased. I see we have more than 140 participants. So this is a very good sign. I have also to thank Thierry Verdier, who is the chairman of the advisory board of the Centro Studi Luca Dagliano, who will introduce Oriana in a little while. So she will do the introduction of Oriana. I have also to thank finally the Fondazione Collegio di San Paolo, who is funding the activities of the Centro Studi. We have been funding them for a long time, and the Compagnia di San Paolo has been a steady partner of the Centro Studi. And for this reason, we start, as usual, with an introduction of the lecture by the chairman, the president of Compagnia di San Paolo, who is Francesco Profumo. Unfortunately, Francesco could not be with us tonight, but he has recorded a message of greetings. And so I will start the lecture with the message of greetings by Francesco, and then Thierry Verdier can introduce Oriana. And then finally, after 3 or 4 hours, we will have Oriana's lectures. You'll be left 5 minutes for your lecture. Now you will be left with more. Naturally, you can, at the end of the lecture, there is a question and answer session so any of you who would like to address any question to Oriana can write in the Q&A session that you have on the bottom of your screen in the Zoom system. And then we will transfer the questions to Oriana, either Thierry or me. We will do that. So without any further ado, maybe we can introduce the greetings by Francesco Profumo, and then Thierry, the floor will be yours. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Compagnia di San Paolo has always supported the activities of the Centro Studi Luca Dagliano, and the link between the two institutions is even stronger now that the Centro Studi is headquartered at Collegio Carlo Alberto. The activities both in Torino and Milano are important for fostering the links between the research communities in the two cities. These days, when all countries have retreated within national boundaries and we cannot travel anymore and meet for lectures like this one, at least the web still allows us to interact globally. hoping that we will be gathering in presence again soon, it's anyhow important that we keep our global perspective on international affairs lively and well informed. Lecture series like the Luca Dagliano are very important to continue our discussion and understanding of where the world is heading to. I'm grateful to the Dagliano family for their support of this institution and of the studies in international and development economics. We are especially honored to have Professor Oriana Bandiera as the lecturer tonight. We are very lucky to have Oriana as the Vice President of Collegio Carlo Alberto. Her contribution to the fostering of the scientific standard of the Collegio is invaluable. And we are even more lucky to be able to share with her tonight her thoughts on the allocation of talents and how can be boost economic growth and development, the topic of this lecture. Reducing inequalities through a better access of potential talents to education and work opportunities, independently of their social and economic background, is also a key objective of the operations of Compagnia di San Paolo. Of course, through Collegio Carlo Alberto, but also with many other initiatives. People is the headline of one of the three core missions of Compagnia. And opportunities, autonomy, inclusion are its three keywords. So thank you very much, Oriana. And I'm looking forward to a wonderful lecture.
Okay, great. Great for this short introduction. The theme of Oriana's talk will be the inequality and the misuse of talent. I think this is an issue of great importance these times of COVID, in general, of course, but especially so during COVID times. And I think that Oriana will touch and will discuss how COVID is making this misuse of talent a really even more serious problem. I think also this is an issue that is relevant for advanced economy, but even more so for developing countries with weaker institutions. So Thierry Verdier has worked a lot on the functioning of institutions and development. So certainly you are perfect. You can introduce Oriana. I'm sure you can perfectly set the work of Oriana into this framework, the framework of this literature and this field of research. Thank you very much, Thierry, for introducing Oriana.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. It's really a great pleasure for me to welcome and to introduce Oriana to this 18 Luca Dagliano lecture. Of course, it would have been even more of a pleasure to have this event in live with everybody around. But given the circumstances, I think we have to go for this new normal Zoom kind of event for a while. We have to be patient, and we hope that at the end things will get back to something more casual and more social. Oriana has its mention in her biography. She's the Sir Anthony Atkinson Professor of Economics at the LSE. But of course, she has also a number of other impressive titles and honors, among which she's the Fellow of the British Academy of the Econometric Society. She's the co-editor of the prestigious Journal of Econometrica, Vice President of the European Economic Association, and she serves in various councils and boards of prestigious institutions, notably the Collegio Carlo Alberto, as was mentioned by Giorgio. In 2019, last year, she received the Yrjö Jahnsson Prize with her co-author Imran Rasool which is the prize given to the best European economist under the age of 45, and which is selected by the European Economic Association. Now, getting more into the meat, Oriana is an applied microeconomist. If you go through our CV, you have to go actually quite to a long list of publications and contributions. And if you start from the beginning, you'll see that probably because of her origins, Oriana is Sicilian. She was born in Catania. She started her career as an economist by studying something rather peculiar, but particularly important for Italy, namely the economics of the mafia, crime organizations, and the market for private protection, which of course at the time, there was not much data available to deepen on that topic. Probably it was kind of very dangerous to collect data at the time on this kind of subject. So most of our contributions on that topic were theoretical contributions, which was doing that with their supervisor, Jim Anderson, who, by the way, is a well-known trade economist that got derived into the mafia stuff, probably because of Oriana. Then Oriana turned to be a more empirical-oriented economist, and she worked essentially in the field of personal economics and development economics. And there, some of the major contributions of Oriana are related to bringing together, on one hand, insights from traditional neoclassical economics, which basically says that incentives, financial incentives and monetary incentives matter for behavior, with insights from other social sciences, such as sociology and sociopsychology, which basically emphasize the importance of social structures and the fact that people are embedded into social networks and express their social preferences when they interact together. In particular, they express preferences like altruism or spite and envy, or social prestige concerns, or fairness and equity concerns. And that actually matters, of course, interacting with financial incentives for the way people behave on the workplace or in other types of organizations. From an empirical perspective, Oriana, with some of our co-authors, in particular Himran Rasool and Iwan Barankai, they designed a series of very interesting, innovative, and pioneering field experiments in the workplace to analyze and to identify very neatly how managerial incentives matter for performances and productivity of workers, and in particular when they interact with the way people are facing social tied together, social connections and their social incentives. In two major papers that were very well cited in the literature, a paper in the QJE in 2005 and in the Econometrica 2009 paper, she analyzed precisely are changes in managerial incentives for one particular firm in the UK, which was a firm of soft fruit picking, and where you had teams of workers that were having a particular task of picking fruits and having supervisors and managers on their top, actually hard changing incentives for managerial people, for the managers, whereas affecting the way they were interacting and the performances of their team workers. In particular, she tended to show that when you increase the sensitivity of the managerial incentives of those people to performances, then those managers, they tend to become sort of more efficient in a certain way, because they tend to interact less with, or to support less co-workers with whom they had initially important social ties, and they tend to focus more on high ability workers. That has a number of applications for the efficiency of firms, as well as productivity and earning inequalities across workers on the workplace. In the development field, Oriana has well made major contributions. And in particular, she provided novel empirical evidence on how, again, the role of social structures and networks for development programs are really relevant to understand how they are delivered on the ground, and as well to understand how this matter for technology adoption in different types of contexts, in particular rural contexts in developing countries. One of the very recent work that she's just to pick up one particular contribution, which I think is a very interesting one in terms of development, and that's maybe related somehow to part of the lecture that she's going to present, is that when she is looking with some co-authors on one very fundamental question that we have in development economics, which is the effectiveness of anti-poverty programs, and how and why is it actually that people stay poor. And in that sense, to make just the context in which Oriana's contributions fits, there are two fundamental reasons for why you have people that are supposedly poor people stay poor. One is that, well, I will say sort of the conservative type of view that people are poor and remain poor because they are not motivated, they don't work enough, they don't have talent, they don't have ability to basically succeed economically, and therefore they stay poor. The second reason, which is the so-called poverty trap view, is that they are poor and remain poor because there's a lack of access to crucial resources and assets. And the institutional framework in which they behave is not really adapted to provide those crucial resources and assets. And in order to identify whether this is the first view or the second view that prevails, Oriana, with some co-authors, she has exploited a large-scale randomized experiment of asset transfer programs in rural Bangladesh. And there, she basically demonstrates that the main mechanism by which poor people remain poor is the poverty trap view, namely that people, it's not because people are not motivated by themselves or they have very specific individual characteristics that prevent them from being rich, but on the opposite, that actually it's because they have a lack of access to crucial resources. In particular, if you can give them enough assets, making them go over a certain threshold, then those people will basically by themselves realize their options and therefore will enrich themselves and get out of the poverty trap. On the opposite, if the assets they have access to for different reasons, because institutions are not well designed or because there are discriminatory processes going on in the economy, then those people will basically remain trapped in such a situation. So those kinds of studies have very big implications for policy. In particular, the fact that you might want to design big push policies to make effective mass poverty reduction programs. So that's really something that is particularly crucial, and I think it's very much worth emphasizing about Oriana's work. Now, today, Oriana is going to present, as is mentioned in the title, something on the issue of inequality and the allocation of talent in a given society, in particular, how this allocation of talent might be more or less efficiently done through different types of institutions and organizations, and what are the implications for economic and social welfare. And I think this is a very timely topic, as Giorgio was mentioning, whether this is for developing countries and developed economies, we understand that talent allocation is really of great importance for economic performances. And in particular, Oriana is going to touch, as was mentioned already, on the impact in such a context of temporary shocks as what we are living right now. Hopefully, we hope that it's a temporary shock, this pandemic, and whether that has actually, in the end, permanent effects eventually on social welfare and economic efficiency. So now, without any more ado, I think that I'm going to give the floor to Oriana for a presentation. And Oriana, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much. It's great to be back virtually in the Collegio. And thank you so much for inviting me to give this lecture. Okay, so it's not news that living standards vary enormously across and within countries. There is a fair agreement that this is due to differences in productivity. That is, differences in endowments of factors account for very little of the observed differences. So I will discuss today how these productivity differences fundamentally depend on the organization of labor. That is, how people of different talents are allocated to different jobs, and how this depends on inequalities. Inequalities that is plural intentionally because the misallocation of talent affects on many dimensions, first and foremost wealth, but also gender and race. So today I will discuss inequalities in wealth and inequalities by gender. So let me start with an anecdote, a personal anecdote. As Thierry said, I come originally from Sicily, from Yrjö in Sicily. And when I was about 17, I think, like early 90s, I moved to Milan. Now, there was a huge gap between Sicily and Milan. There is still a huge gap today, say about a factor of 3. So moving from a place to another place, which is 3 times richer, is quite shocking. You see, especially if you're 17 and you're not used to see different places. So everything was shinier, the shops were better, people were dressed better, anything that you can imagine a rich country has and a poor country doesn't. But now, the puzzle that I kept bumping in is, no offense to anybody from Milan, but the average person that you met in Milan, the average baker, the average fishmonger, the average barman, they were really not as smart as the Sicilian equivalent. In fact, in Sicily, my father always said that the smartest man he knew was a client of his whose job was to sell sandwiches off a truck. So I kept wondering why it was that, despite all these people being so smart, Sicily was so much poorer. It took me many years to understand that it was because people that were so smart were selling bread and sandwiches that Sicily were poorer. In fact, this regularity, this anecdote, can be transformed into a fact if you look at the data. These are OECD data on skills of adults. The OECD has collected this data set where they test adults in different jobs on 3 skills: numeracy, literacy, and problem solving. Here I'm showing you numeracy. And what I'm doing is I'm taking the top jobs, managers, professionals, ISCO codes 1 and 2, for those of you familiar with this. And then I'm taking the bottom jobs, blue collar jobs. Okay, so the equivalent of my dad's friend selling sandwiches. And then I'm looking at how the median blue collar worker, his skills, how they relate to the bottom managers. A ratio larger than 1 means that half of the blue collar workers actually have better skills than the worst managers. Okay? So here you see that this ratio is strongly decreasing in GDP. That is, in richer countries, the managers have much better skills than the blue collar workers. That is, even the bottom manager has skills which are superior to those of the median blue collar worker. You can see that for all the other measures too. Okay, this is problem solving. Actually, the scale in problem solving is even bigger. It goes up to 1.4, and in literacy as well. And if you want to look at where Italy is about there at 1.1. Okay? So this is a problem, clearly, because managers and professionals have a much larger impact on economic activity. And so the gains from swapping until all the managers are more talented than all the blue-collar workers. It's also important because of the incentives that the system gives. In particular, our system is based on meritocracy as an incentive. If you work hard and you accumulate skills, you should get better jobs. If in reality the job you get depends on the job that your father had, the incentive to work hard goes down quite a bit. So there are two reasons for why this misallocation matters. The first is a static reason, that is, at a given point in time, you're not using the talent of the best people to do the most important jobs. And the second is a more dynamic reason, that is, in expectation of this happening, nobody has an incentive to accumulate skills. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show consequences of misallocation on these two dimensions, the one coming from wealth inequality and from gender inequality. Let me start with wealth. So here is a loop. Okay? You can start at any point in the loop. It goes always around. So let's start with inequality. Inequality in an unequal distribution of wealth typically results in different access to opportunities. That is, the children of poor parents have less chance to go to good schools, less chance to go to school for long, and this results in a misallocation of talent. As we saw in the graphs earlier, this results in somebody smart ending up being a blue-collar worker. This has two consequences. At an individual welfare level, it creates poverty. At an aggregate level, it affects productivity because the more talented person is replaced by a less talented but richer person. And this feeds back because low productivity leads to low GDP. And again, that keeps the inequality as it is. So here is a graph that illustrates the first direction, the first arrow here at the top. That is the relationship between inequality and access to opportunity. In the graph, you have the Gini coefficient on the horizontal axis, measure of inequality, and the intergenerational income elasticity on the vertical axis. The intergenerational income elasticity tells you how correlated the income of a person is to the income of their parents. So if that number is high, it means that basically your income is the same as your dad. And you see that basically more unequal countries have fewer opportunities. So your job and income is determined by the job and income of your parents. Is this optimal? Well, we've already argued that probably it is not. And this brings us to the theme that Thierry already gave a preview of, which is the link between jobs and poverty. Right? If you look globally, so going beyond Sicily versus Milan, if you look globally, most of the poor are at work. So poverty is not a matter of unemployment. People work, but they work in pretty bad jobs. Actually, the jobs that the poorest people in the world do are remarkably similar to what an Uber driver does. Okay? They're uncertain. There is no employer, so people are self-employed. They have low pay, and they're very irregular. In most cases, in rural economies, these jobs are casual agricultural labor jobs, whereby people go to the square of the village every morning at 5 a.m. And if there is a landowner that needs help, they get recruited and they work for that day. If there isn't, they go back home without earnings. Okay, these graphs come from a new database that we are putting together. It will soon be publicly available. And it's a database that harmonizes all the censuses and the DHS, and soon to come the LFS, which basically puts together all the information that we have on labor markets in low-income countries. What you see in these graphs is that salary jobs, that is the normal type of jobs that we have, that we consider jobs, where an employer employs you for a given amount of time and pays you a regular wage every month, are very rare in low-income countries. And they are particularly rare for the poorest people. So the poorest people in the middle graph are the red line. You see that these are all low to middle income countries. You see that the ratio of salary job is close to 0 in the poorest countries, and it goes to a maximum of 0.3 in kind of the richest of the middle income countries, places like Brazil. The opposite is true for casual jobs. So as Thierry explained already, there are two views of poverty. One is that people have access to exactly the same opportunities. in that world, the only reason why the poor do bad jobs is because they cannot do anything else. So essentially, that view of the world is the view of a hill that anybody can climb. The gift here is courtesy of my daughter. She did it when she was 6. Now she's embarrassed of it, but I think it still gives you the sense of what's going on. So essentially, in a hilly world, it doesn't matter where you start. You'll always end up in the same place if you have the same skills. What's the economics behind this? Well, people start with different levels of wealth and access to productive assets. Might this be human capital or physical capital? You get a hill if the returns are higher when the assets are low. So each small investment makes a big difference. When you get a hill, the people with the same talent will be able to reach the same point, regardless of where they started. The other view of the world is a view in which people more or less are all the same, but some people have different access opportunities. So that means that some of the poor have the talent to do the same jobs as the rich, but they simply can't afford to do it. So that view is more like a steep mountain. The two people who are identical, but are born in wealth and in poverty respectively, end up in very different points because of this very steep segment of what we will see later is the production function. So what's the economics behind the mountain? You get a mountain if you need a large investment in order to get a return. In this world, a small investment does not allow you to climb. Think of a human capital investment. Going to university for a month is not going to make any difference. So if all you can afford is 1 month of university, it's pointless to do it, because unless you complete your degree, it is the same as having the high school degree. So that implies that identical people will reach different points depending on where they started. Hence, two people with exactly the same skills, talent, and motivation will end up rich or poor, depending on whether they were born that way. In other words, this is a world with poverty traps. Okay? A poverty trap is, as we will see, both unfair and inefficient. Now, in our recent work, we test for poverty traps. And the way we do it is that we take people like the blue person there, who are really at the bottom. They are the poorest women in the poorest villages, in the poorest regions of Bangladesh, which is a poor country. And these poor women have casual jobs, while the richer women in the villages tend cows. The program gives the opportunity to the poor women to do the jobs of the rich women. So it gives them a cow. Now, a cow is worth 1 year of income. There is no way they can borrow to finance it. So the value of transfer is about $1,000 in purchasing power parity. The average microloan that these people have access to is $100. Now, with $100, you can buy a tenth of a cow. There's not much you can do with a tenth of a cow. With a cow, on the other hand, can push them up the hill or the mountain. Then we can compare those who started with nothing to those who started with very little. And this is a very large sample, so we can do this quite precisely. And we can see if we get a hill or we get a mountain. In other words, what we need to do, these are the same as before without the little figures. What we need to do is to estimate the relationship between assets at time t, when they got the transfer, and assets 2-3 years later. Okay? In our data, we do 4 years actually. And we can see whether the relationship looks like the one on the left, which is the hill, or whether it looks like the one on the right, which is the mountain. That's how it looks. So these are the actual data where you have baseline productive assets in 2007 on the horizontal axis, and then you have productive assets in 2011 on the vertical axis. Okay? That's the steep mountain. And the most important point in that graph is that one there, because that tells you the difference between those who escape, those to the right of the point escape, and those to the left fall back. In our sample, there are about 2/3 of people on the green side and 1/3 on the red side. The difference between those who escape and those who can't is very little. It's the value of a cart. A cart is what you use to transport the produce of the cow to the market. So if you had a cart, or if you had the equivalent in assets worth of a cart, the transfer is enough to get you out of poverty. If you didn't, you fall back. And we followed them for a long time, 11 years. Actually, we now got the data last week for 13 years. And we see that the two groups keep diverging. Okay? So this is a sustainable route out of poverty. Poverty traps are clearly unfair and inefficient. Unfair because two people with the same talent end up with very different standards of living because of accident at birth. Inefficient because highly talented people who are born poor will not be able to exploit that talent and will be replaced by a less talented and richer person. If I go back to my anecdote in Sicily, it wasn't really the case that everybody was smarter. What was the case was that intelligence was evenly distributed, democratically distributed across social classes. We knew very clever fishmongers, but equally stupid doctors. So what do we learn for policy? Well, the first thing is that you need big transfers. A transfer big enough will push people past the threshold and reduce poverty in the long run. Now, this seems to be very expensive, but in reality, once you take into account the fact that you will not have to support people after the transfer, it adds up and it turns out to be a lot cheaper than giving consumption support year after year. Okay? Unfortunately, the same works in reverse. Shocks that send people below the threshold will have a permanent effect that outlives the duration of the shock. This will help us understand the effect of large shocks like COVID. And this is what I'm going to do next. I'm still going to stay in Bangladesh for the time being. I'm going to move out of Bangladesh soon. And I'm going to tell you the results of a survey of 7,000 households who live in urban slums and rural areas. Okay? We interviewed them and collected information on their jobs before and after the lockdown policy, which was enacted in March and April. Now, at baseline, we still see the same correlation between wealth and job type. In this graph, we have wealth on the horizontal axis and the prevalence of the three types of jobs: casual jobs, small businesses, and salary jobs. You see that the salary jobs are very rare, except for the richest. Casual jobs are very common, except for the richest. And the small businesses are kind of the middle class type of occupation. Now, what happens, most surprisingly to us, is that after the lockdown, many people change jobs. Okay? If you start from the bottom of this figure, the number in the middle, the 61%, is the share of people who had a business at the start and still have a business at the end. So 40% of business owners lose business. The vast majority of them end up in casual labor. If you follow that big fat line, it goes up to casual labor. And a smaller fraction goes into salaried labor. Also from salaried labor, 74% of them keep their job. So salaried jobs are more secure, but a good 25% move to casual labor. Now, can you guess who keeps their jobs if the jobs are good? Well, it's kind of easy to guess given the topic of the lecture. It's the richest people who manage to keep their businesses. Here you see that the average wealth of a person who had a business and keeps their business is 236,000 takas. Doesn't matter how much that is, but it is double the average wealth of the person who loses the business and ends up as a casual worker. Same thing for salaried workers. The average wealth of the person who keeps their salaried jobs is twice as large as the wealth of the person who loses it. What that means is that there is a misallocation because the profitable businesses with poor owners are replaced by less profitable businesses with wealthier owners. So if you focus only on the left-hand side of this graph, this gives you the earnings wealth frontier for leavers and entrants into the business sector. And you see how for low levels of wealth, the profits that people lose are very high compared to high levels of wealth. So in other words, what this is saying is that for an owner who has the lowest level of wealth and he loses the business, he can have profits as high as 17,000. If the owner were at the other end of the wealth distribution, he can survive until profits go below 15,000. So you see that basically wealthier owners are capable of keeping their businesses and poorer owners lose them. And the opposite happens at the entry. So you have a misallocation because you lose profitable businesses just because their owners were poor. So ultimately, the effect of COVID depends on jobs type. This gives people incentives to change jobs. Wealthier people get better jobs. This leads to inequality and misallocation. Unfortunately, this leads to the conclusion that the effect of the pandemic will last longer than the pandemic itself. Because of these feedback mechanisms, the pandemic will push people, well, is pushing people beyond the poverty threshold into a newly formed poverty trap. So as I promised, this is not a problem that only affects farmers. We can go to the richest economies in the world and the most, supposedly the highest social mobility country. And this is a paper which is really nice. It's by two of my colleagues and a lot of other people. They look at who becomes an inventor in America. And they show that basically the probability of you becoming an inventor is 10 times as high if you compare the top 1% of parents' income to the median parents' income. The median, not the bottom 10%, the median. Why inventors? Why inventors important? Because ultimately growth is a matter of finding new technologies, finding a better way of producing with less resources. So that's telling you that we are in the hands of the top 1% of the population by wealth, not by talent. Right, let me go to the second part, which is gender. So women are underrepresented in the labor force, and especially in top jobs. These are OECD data, and they give you the share of women in management, the share of women in the boards of companies. Okay, you see that the share is everywhere less than the population share, which should be 50%. Actually, the OECD is around 30% for the managers, and it's around 25% for the boards. Okay? Now, if you look at the consequences that this has, there is a very nice paper. This is a bit publicity for the journal by Chang Tai-Xie and co-authors in Econometrica. And what they do in this paper, actually, I really like the first sentence of the paper in the abstract. They go like, in 1960, 94% of doctors and lawyers were white men. By 2010, the fraction was just 62%, which is way higher than the population share. And what they do in the paper is that they go on calibrate a model and show that between 20 and 40% of growth was due to reallocation. So nothing else changing, without changing technology, without changing human capital, without changing anything. Just the fact that you put women into dentistry, and also Black, because they do both gender and race, can explain 40% of the growth in the US in the last 20 years. Now, how bad is the misallocation of women's across the world? So far we didn't know. Most of the studies are done in the US, but you might think, and actually there's reason to believe, that in low-income countries with more restrictive gender norms, the misallocation is even worse. Okay? So what we do, this is very new, it's the second time that I show this to the public, because we have an agreement with a large multinational, which has to be stay anonymous for now. And we have personnel data from this multinational across 100 countries. Okay? And what we can do is to see whether the women that end up working in countries where the labor force participation is low are of higher ability. The intuition being that if you work despite the fact that no other women work, the bar that you have to pass is much higher. And so what we can do is we estimate a model of pay setting by the firm, and this allows us to calibrate the ability of the people who are at work and the payoff from staying from home. And you see that women's ability is much higher. It's higher everywhere in all the countries in which this firm operates. And the difference, which you see here on this graph on the left-hand side, the difference is decreasing. This is the blue line is the ability for women, and the orange line is the ability for men. You see the ability for men is mostly flat across the distribution of labor force participation, whereas the ability of women is much higher than the ability for men, and then it goes down as more women enter the labor force, which is exactly as predicted by a model where you have a distribution of ability and a threshold, and as this threshold moves to the left, less and less able people come into the workforce. And you can see from here that it's not just an artifact of the mean. If you compare these three panels, the first panel covers ability of men and women in countries where labor force participation is less than a third for women. The second panel is when the labor force participation is between a third and 50%. And the final panel is more than 50%. And you see how the blue and orange distributions are almost separate in the first panel. That means that almost all the women who are working for this firm are smarter than the men who are working for this firm. And then the two distributions come to converge in the last group of countries. Now, an implication of this is that our estimates of the gender wage gap are actually optimistic because they don't take into account the ability differential between men and women. So here is ILO estimates for the gender gap for managers and professionals. Again, the ISCO codes 1 and 2. And you see that that's about 20%. That's the number that we know. Women earn 20% less than men for the same job. We should just stop working in October. I'm not sure what I'm doing here. But once you take into account ability, the gap is even larger. So the dotted line is the gap without correcting for ability. The solid line is when you correct for ability. On the horizontal axis, we have the female to male labor force participation. And you see how the adjustment is bigger, the lower is the labor force participation. So countries like Egypt, Turkey, Mexico, that are all here on the low end of labor force participation, they basically have a lot to gain because they're only using the talent of the very best women. Now, as we have two views of poverty, we can have the same two views of gender, right? On the one hand, you can think that women have a comparative advantage at housekeeping or childcare. This is compatible with them being equally, if not more able in the workplace. But the issue is like, as long as there is a comparative advantage, specialization makes sense. You might remember the Ricardo example of comparative advantage in the trade between Britain and Portugal, which will not happen anymore after January, whatever, 1st. But in that example, of course, England was more productive at both wine and cloth, but Portugal was relatively better at wine, and it still made sense to trade and specialize. So same thing here. So that is kind of the frictionless market explanation of why we see fewer women in the labor force. The poverty trap explanation is that women and men have the same skills, and there can be two equilibria, one in which women specialize staying at home, and one in which they share it equally. The issue is that we need to find the equivalent of poverty to coordinate to the low equilibrium. So maybe it's norms, we're not very sure. But let's see about the comparative advantage. There are two ways that we can look at whether it's comparative advantage. The first way is by looking at child penalties. These graphs come from the work of my colleague Camille Landel. What he does with his co-authors is that he follows couples before and after they have children. In these graphs, the orange is men and the green is women. And the 0 on the graph corresponds to the moment where the first child is born. You see that, and the two series are hours worked and the participation in the labor market. You see that in all these graphs, the moment the child is born, the woman drops out. Why is this informative of comparative advantage? Well, because I've split the graphs in two. The first panel is couples where the wife earned more before the birth of the child. So supposedly, this is couples where the woman has a comparative advantage in work outside the home. The bottom panel is the opposite combination, where the man earned more before the birth of the child. Now, if you expect comparative advantage to explain the allocation between housework and outside work, we should find the difference between the upper panel and the lower panel. And yet, there is no difference. Okay? Women drop out of the labor force at the same rate, regardless of whether they had comparative advantage of work before or not. Another piece of evidence, everybody's favorite shock, time use after COVID. These are UK data, and this is a time use survey where they ask people to report the number of hours dedicated to different activities. These being paid work, housework, children, and uninterrupted paid work. Again, we split the couples between those where the father earned more before the COVID shock and those where the mother earned more. And all these bars represent mother hours to father hours. So the relevant number to look for is 1, which is this line over here. Now, looking at paid work, it looks like things are going more or less according to comparative advantage. where mother earn more, the ratio is larger, although it is still pretty much at 1. When you look at housework, it also seems like comparative advantage is applied. When the father earns more, the mom ends up doing twice as much housework. When the mother earns more, they share it equally. But when we come to childcare, that's when things get really puzzling, because it doesn't matter who earned more before. It's always the mother who takes care of the children. Right? So that cannot be comparative advantage. What about norms? Well, we can correlate the ability gap that we estimate in our paper with the multinational to the prevalence of conservative or traditional gender norms. Things about being a housewife is a good thing, children suffer if the mother works, if jobs are scarce, men have more rights than women. And you see that throughout, the ability gap correlates with the prevalence of traditional norms. So there seems to be clearly a coordination effect that these norms play that keep women in charge of children and away from the jobs where they would use their talent at best. So in conclusions, what we learn is that inequalities generate misallocation of talent. Misallocation lowers productivity and fosters more inequality. And this affects how we think of shocks and policies, because short-run changes can have very long-term consequences. So if I think of what's going to happen after COVID, I think we're going to face a very different world. In theory, in a frictionless market world, this shouldn't happen, because the economy shut down because of COVID. It should reopen exactly the same as it was, as if it had been hibernated. But in practice, because the COVID shock threw many people below the poverty threshold and got many women out of the labor force, I think once the pandemic is gone, and once the happiness of the pandemic being gone will wear off, we will wake up to a much more unequal and much more inefficient world. Sorry, on a very grim note, I'm done with the lecture.
Oriana, I think this was really a wonderful lecture, and we had a very lively debate. As I told you, we had a very, very high number of participants, above 200, and we had the record number of questions. So maybe we can send you questions so that you can then somehow maybe address some of them that we had to elude more precisely, more specifically. Anyway, thank you very much, and I promise we promise you a lot of other social entertainment in the future when you come to Turin, and also to Thierry, which is always part of our lectures, and always
when it's safer to go to restaurants.
When it's safer to go to restaurant, exactly, we will certainly treat you well here. So thank you very much to everybody. I thank again all the organizers and the supporter of our lecture every year. I really hope that next year we will be able to have it in presence. I think we are running through a kind of a web fatigue, a digital fatigue, and I think we deserve to go back to physical things, and I'm really looking forward that this will happen soon. So thank you very much, Oriana. Thank you very much, Thierry, and good luck.
Thank you very much, Oriana. Thank you very much, Georgie.
Thank you, Thierry. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Inviting me.
Bye, bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello. Thank you, everybody, for coming to my talk. There were many questions in the Q&A, so I've made a short video to answer most of them. So the first question was about ability. I spoke a lot about talent and ability in a general way. And you can think of two types of ability. You can think of talent, which is general. Some people are just better at everything. Or talent that's specific to jobs. And misallocation applies to both things. You have misallocation on general talent when more talented people end up doing jobs for which their talent is less used. And you have misallocation on job-specific talent when, for instance, all the men are engineers, despite some of them being very talented for being social workers. Next question, is the likelihood of facing a mountain related to institutional features like corruption and cronyism? So this relates to the poverty trap model, where I showed you that it makes a big difference if the way to transform wealth from one period to the other is a smooth concave function like a hill or a steep mountain face. And I attributed the steep mountain face to the difference in technology, but actually that could come from the arrangement, the institutional features of society, as this question asks. For instance, if society is very corrupt and you need a fixed amount of wealth to pay your way through. How were cows allocated? This refers to the program in Bangladesh where the poorest women were given cows. The cows were given to all the poorest women in the treatment villages, and our control group are the same poorest women that satisfy the same criteria, but are in control villages. Treatment and control have been randomized. If there is assortative matching by education, wealth may be correlated with inheritable skills. So the idea is like if smart women marry smart men, the kids will be smart. Possibly, but there is overwhelming evidence that what matters is really the wealth that you're born with, not the intelligence of your parents. There is a very nice paper from using data from Sweden that follows adoptive children. And it shows that, it has data on the wealth of the adoptive parents and the wealth of the birth parents. And it shows that really is the wealth that you have when you're a kid that matters. Which policies can help allocate talent efficiently? Well, first and foremost, education from a very early age, high quality education starting from the age of 3, available to everybody. So the state has to compete or has to subsidize private education so it's affordable to everybody. It makes little sense to talk about parity when it comes to tertiary education if the rest of the system is geared against people of a lower socioeconomic background. That is, if you haven't received a good education in secondary school, you cannot do well at university. It's pointless to push people through university when that's too late. How much of the misallocation is due to preferences? I don't think anybody prefers to be misallocated. You could argue that women like to be housewives. This is kind of a more fatty. There is plenty of evidence that by revealed preference, whenever somebody has the chance to do what people who are better off are doing, they end up doing it themselves. When it comes to women and housework, for instance, there are nice papers in the US where they show that when the cost of domestic service falls, for instance, because there is an inflow of migrants, women hire domestic service and go out to work. Does meritocracy deepen inequality? If so, should we abandon it? As far as I know, we don't really have meritocracy. What we have is a system of privilege by which people who are born in wealth continue to accumulate wealth without much merit in it. Meritocracy will create inequality. It might create as much inequality as we currently have, but there will be a lot more wealth to share about. So for the same level of inequality, we can all be a lot better off. How do your findings relate to social mobility? Very much so. In fact, inequality, linking to the previous question, wouldn't be a problem if it were the result of difference in talent. It might still be a problem from the point of view of equity. We might not like a society that rewards enormously people just because they're born smart. But it wouldn't be a matter of inefficiency. Inefficiency only arises when differences in wealth at birth misallocate talent. And that is lack of social mobility. And unfortunately, inequality is very highly correlated with social immobility. More unequal societies are societies in which kids are more likely to do the same jobs as their dad, and wealth begets wealth. Do managers overvalue their skills relative to workers? So this refers to the graph where I showed you the relative ability of managers and workers. Those numbers are actually coming from objective tests. These people sat a test and those are the grades that they got. So it's not their own subjective assessment. Although I'm sure that people who are in position of power, like managers, think that they deserve being there, even if sometimes they don't. Is lack of evidence of poverty traps evidence of the lack of poverty traps? This is a very interesting question because although theorists have been talking about poverty traps for a long time, in practice, evidence has been very elusive until the paper that I showed you. And the reason for that is actually quite simple if you think about it. For there to be a poverty trap, there has to be a threshold level below which people fall in the trap and above which people escape. In other words, that threshold is an unstable equilibrium. So if you look at data, you will never see anybody around the threshold. Now, we're lucky because the program that we evaluate actually, by chance, put 4,000 people just right by the threshold, and so we can estimate it. If we repeat the exercise in the control villages where there was no transfer, we don't find anybody there, and we don't find any evidence of poverty traps, just because there's nobody who can escape and nobody who can fall back, because there's nobody around it. Which is the role of NGOs, so like BRAC, in eliminating poverty and inequality? Without doubt, NGOs have done a lot in the last 50 or so years. Often they have intervened where the government is lacking. I see two problems with this. The first is that there is no coordination between different NGOs, and so you can end up in villages where different people get different programs from different NGOs, and the program cancel each other out. And the second problem, which is somewhat more severe, is that NGOs are not elected by the government. They're not accountable to the population. So they can pursue their own mission. Some NGOs are religious and pursue their religion. Others have other aims. Most importantly, they're not accountable to the people that they serve. Microloans have a repayment rate of 98%. Are they ineffective because they're poorly used? Well, they are effective for the microfinance institutions who issue them. They make a good profit. They are ineffective because the repayments is due in a week, and the loan itself is very small. So really the only thing you can use it for is consumption. Will politicians act against inequality if they see how much money is left on the table? Well, that's why I work on this, and that's why I keep talking about it. I hope somebody listens, because there's a good case. Regardless of whether you believe society is willing to accept a high level of inequality or not, if inequality is decoupled from merit and coupled only to privilege, everybody loses. Thank you.